This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
UN raises more than $1 billion in aid pledges as it warns of a looming humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. Tightening ties, Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett holds talks with Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. And bandits released 240 inmates in an attack on a Nigerian prison. Hello and thank you for joining us on Africa Live. I am Peninah Karibe, and joining me with the business headlines is Uche.
Thank you, Peninah. And here's a look at what's coming up on Africa Live Biz. Tanzania ratifies the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. And Egypt resumes sale of stakes in its state-owned enterprises as economic conditions improve. Of course, all that coming up within the program. For now, back to you, Peninah.
Thank you, Uche. We begin the hour in Geneva, where UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says more than $1 billion in aid pledges have been made following an emergency appeal for Afghanistan. Guterres made the announcement during a UN conference seeking $606 million to meet the most pressing needs of a country in crisis. The UN chief, however, said it was too early to say how much of the money had been promised in response to the emergency appeal. Guterres says food supplies in Afghanistan could run out by the end of this month. According to the World Food Programme, 14 million people are on the brink of starvation. All right, let's get more now from Tony. She's live for us in Brussels. Tony, more than $1 billion in aid pledges for Afghanistan. What more can you tell us?
Yeah, more than $1 billion. But as you rightly mentioned there, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres saying that at this point in time, it's impossible to know how much of that money is actually going to his organization, because even as we heard, the United States pledged $64 million, France $117 million, Australia $73 million. They weren't specific when it came to how that money was going to be distributed, whether or not they would be using that money unilaterally to send aid to Afghanistan. We also heard from China saying that they're going to start stepping up their financial assistance. They had said last week that they were going to provide $31 million in humanitarian aid, and that they have started their distribution of COVID vaccines, 3 million doses being sent over to Afghanistan. So it's unclear at this point whether or not the UN achieved that goal of raising $606 million. But what they did appear to achieve is a mobilization of the global economies to tackle what Guterres called a looming humanitarian crisis. He said that poverty is spiraling, that public services are on the verge of collapse, and that many people are going to run out of food by the end of the month. And that is really the most critical concern right now. It is that food supply. So a third of the money that has been pledged is going to be earmarked for the World Food Program. 14 million people, they say right now, are on the verge of starvation. And this is really a chronic problem for Afghanistan. Even before the Taliban took over on August 15th, more than half of the population, roughly 18 million people, were dependent on foreign aid. And this is an issue that has been exacerbated in the following weeks, especially as we've seen billions of dollars in foreign funds dry up. A lot of governments very distrustful of the Taliban and not wanting to send any sort of money to this new government. But take a listen to what Mr. Guterres had to say just a little while ago.
The people of Afghanistan need a lifeline. After decades of war, suffering and insecurity, they face perhaps their most perilous hour. Now is the time for the international community to stand with them. And let us be clear, this conference is not simply about what we will give to the people of Afghanistan. It is about what we owe.
Excellencies, ensuring sustainable development and promoting respect for human rights require political stability and peace in Afghanistan. And peace cannot be consolidated unless Afghanistan is provided the necessary economic and fiscal space. Past mistakes must not be repeated. The Afghan people must not be abandoned.
Well, a lot of countries are still trying to figure out what their humanitarian aid is going to look like. There have been exceptions, countries that have continued to supply food, money, medical supplies, medical equipment. China and Pakistan, for example, have sent planefuls of this type of aid to Afghanistan already. Of course, both of those countries share a border with Afghanistan, and they don't want to see a humanitarian crisis lead to a refugee crisis. Russia says that it is going to step up its aid, and in fact, a plane from the UAE landed in Kabul today, providing some of that assistance.
Anthony, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres saying the world body is struggling financially and general donor fatigue remains a concern. How is this likely to affect fundraising for Afghanistan's humanitarian crisis?
Well, the funding crisis, the problem that the UN specifically is having is that they're having difficulty paying their people on the ground. And this is because money has been very difficult to get in and out of banks. There is an asset freeze on $10 billion worth of government assets, and that has made it very difficult. Cash is in very short supply, which is, of course, exacerbating the food problem because people don't have the physical money to go and buy enough supply. So that's the problem that the UN is having. But I think that the bigger problem that they're going to have in convincing governments to hand over this type of funding is a distrust of the Taliban. None of these governments want to see any of this money directed to the new government. And a lot of them, in fact, would like to see a bulk of this money be spent on the surrounding countries, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, to protect and support the refugees that have already fled Afghanistan and could flee Afghanistan in the future. They also want some sort of reassurance from the Taliban, even better yet, some sort of proof from the Taliban that they are more tolerant and more open. They want to see them respecting human rights, particularly women's rights. They want to make sure that Afghanistan does not once again become a safe haven for terrorist or criminal organizations, and they're waiting on that reassurance. In the meantime, it doesn't seem to be going in that direction. We heard from the UN human rights chief just hours before this pledging event kicked off, saying that the Taliban is breaking its promises already, particularly when it comes to rights for women. So this is the reassurance that the most Western countries and a lot of countries are looking for, but whether or not they're going to receive that, we'll have to wait and see.
All right, Tony Waterman live for us in Brussels. Thank you, Tony, for that. Now, Taliban officials have ordered schools in Afghanistan to be segregated by gender. The group announced on Sunday that women would be allowed to study in universities. However, they must be separated from men. In an exclusive interview, Afghanistan's acting Minister of Higher Education told us that the ministry will push for a curriculum that is not contradictory to Islamic and national values. He expects the number of students pursuing higher education to increase.
If we look at the past 20 years, we could easily figure out that most Afghan families wanted to send their children to school, but they couldn't make it due to widespread social immorality and misconduct. With the announcement of recent policies, thousands of Afghans will have the opportunity to send their children to pursue higher education. That's why I have told the private institutions that there will be an increase in the number of students after the new policy is implemented, and they have confirmed this.
Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett has held talks with Egypt's President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi following his visit to the North African country. The two leaders discussed regional and bilateral issues as well as the revival of the Israel-Palestine peace process, which collapsed in 2014. This is the first official trip by an Israeli head of government to Egypt in a decade. Bennett, who succeeded Benjamin Netanyahu in June, was invited by President Sisi last month. CGTN's Adel Mahri now joins me from Cairo for the latest on this visit. He joins me on the phone. So Adel, what are the key highlights of this meeting?
This is basically a continuation of Egyptian-led efforts to revive the peace talks. The meeting comes, as you said, it's the first of its kind between an Egyptian president and Israeli prime minister in 10 years. The latest was between President Mubarak and Benjamin Netanyahu just a couple of weeks before the 2011 January uprising. And this specific meeting comes just 10 days after Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi invited both Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas and Jordanian King Abdullah to a summit to discuss the Palestinian file. The meeting indicates and the invitation extended from Egypt indicates that Egypt believes there is great hope in reviving the peace talks as negotiations develop. In the recent weeks, we've seen an intense amount of meetings taking place. The Egyptian head of the General Intelligence Bureau, Abbas Kamel, has visited Israel and the Palestinian territories twice in the past 2 months. The Egyptian foreign minister has also paid a visit. Egypt has intensified meetings between Palestinian factions. So Cairo has been moving intensely to put some final format to revive the peace talks. There is also an Egyptian initiative to hold an international conference for Palestine as a step to gather international community support to give and push the peace talks to once again convince the Israelis and Palestinians to sit on the negotiating table.
Adel, thank you very much for that. Adel Mahroui on the line from Cairo. In Nigeria, unidentified gunmen attacked a jail in Kogi State and set free 240 inmates, according to a prison service spokesperson. He said numerous attackers engaged the guards in a fierce gun battle. Security agencies are pursuing the gang. The statement by the spokesperson has not indicated casualties from either side involved in the gunfight. At the time of the raid, the prison had 294 inmates, the majority of whom were pre-trial detainees. For more on this, we're joined by Tessem Akende, who is in Jos in Nigeria. Good to see you, Tessem. 240 inmates released by bandits. What more can you tell us?
Well, it's been it's been confirmed by officials of the Nigeria Correctional Service, but beyond the confirmation, a detailed investigation has been launched, and they are ensuring that they fish out, those who are actually behind what has happened. In circumstances like this, many times you have fifth columnists or people, perhaps even personnel of the service conniving, to carry out these acts. So these are things that the investigation will be looking out to ensure that it gets all the parties involved. Well, this is also ensuring that citizens, of course, the service is also tasking citizens to support by giving it information as to how, to ensure that, the inmates who have been freed are actually brought back. It has ordered a procedure to, have all the inmates brought back, recapture all of them. This is what is going on. It's in Kogi State. It's actually at a medium security correctional center. The service insists that this has happened and it does not speak well, but it ensures that it will go out. The Commandant General of the Nigeria Correctional Service says he will be leading an investigation to Kogi State to ensure that this is addressed and addressed very well.
Earlier, there were reports of bandits killing 12 soldiers and police officers in a separate attack. What's the latest?
Yeah, like the latest is that there's no confirmation yet from the military authorities, but Chief of Army Staff, who until Saturday was in Zamfara himself, leading bombardments against bandits in that state, left for Abuja, where the military, especially the army, precisely the army, are putting heads together to ensure that the security challenges confronting Nigeria are addressed and addressed very well. The Chief of Army Staff, a few hours ago, told his officers and men that he will not take any excuses. He wants the battle against security threats, against the Nigerian state defeated once and for all. We have the farmer-herder clashes in the north-central part of the country. We have terrorism and insurgency in the northeastern part of the country. And then we have the challenge of banditry and kidnapping for ransom in the northwestern part of the country. These issues are to be addressed and addressed very sincerely. And the Army will, based on what the Chief of Army Staff is saying, we'll be partnering other security agencies to ensure that Nigeria, peace is restored to Nigeria once and for all.
Tessem Akende in Jos, thank you very much. You're watching Africa Live. Let's take a short break. Coming up, reconciliation talks between Somali President and Prime Minister collapse. And the Democratic People's Republic of Korea says it has test-fired a long-range cruise missile.
Africa is a continent of diversity, with varied climates and enchanting geography, and a people so distinct, but with a shared enduring spirit. We are at the heart of the continent to bring you the untold stories.
Let's have a look.
We celebrate Africa as it shapes its own destiny.
Tunis, Cairo,
Juba, Ethiopia,
Tanzania.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
I try to not let it affect me, but there are days when it does. I'm a human being, and to see patients in a hospital bed and their family members are not there, there's no one there to hold their hand, that human touch, you know?
I just hope everyone can remember that the situation is not permanent and that everything will get better eventually.
Let's head to Somalia, where rift between the president and his prime minister continues. Closed-door talks on Friday and Saturday have failed to reconcile the two sides. The president and the prime minister have been feuding over the dismissal and appointment of key security officials. As CGTN's Joy Kiruki Juma reports, it all began with the disappearance of a female intelligence agent.
In June, female spy Ikran Dakhlil disappeared under mysterious circumstances in Mogadishu. Local reports say she could have been abducted by Al-Shabaab operatives in the city and later killed.
On Ikran Dakhlil's disappearance, which, as you may have heard, has attracted a lot of public interest, it is my principal position that credible investigation of this case is necessary, and that all obstructions to getting justice for Ikran and her family must be removed.
Prime Minister Roble had suspended the intelligence chief Fahad Yassin over his handling of the agent's disappearance. This touched off a political spat between President Mohamed Farmajo and the Prime Minister. President Farmajo declared the Prime Minister's move unconstitutional and went ahead to appoint a new head of intelligence without consulting the PM. The rift comes as the Horn of Africa nation gears up to organize polls that have been twice delayed.
I think there is always a concern when two important parties have a rift, and in particular as we're going towards the elections. But I believe that the discussions that we had with them today and those that they are having themselves look as though they will resolve those disputes and the elections will go ahead. We do impress upon them that it is important to resolve those as quickly as possible.
Prime Minister Roble told a UN delegation led by the UN Deputy Secretary General that the vote would go ahead as planned. Joy Kiruki Juma, CGTN.
A delegation from the West African bloc ECOWAS has been in Guinea for mediation efforts following a military coup. Guinean President Alpha Conde earlier this month was deposed by soldiers and has been detained ever since. ECOWAS last week suspended Guinea's membership to the 15-member bloc but did not impose further sanctions. The delegation has now met the coup leaders and said mediators have seen the deposed president. ECOWAS consultant Ken Ife says the bloc may send multiple delegations to negotiate with Guinea's coup leaders.
First mission is usually to go and find out if the president is still alive, the one that was overthrown, and then his officers, and then to know, what condition are they living under, and then maybe to demand that they be released unconditionally. So things like that's the beginning, and then after the mission comes back with a report, then they might escalate. They might now send a second mission to lay down conditions that, you have to organize an election and get a new democracy. democratically elected. So we don't know what the conditions would be. It has been very, very successful. And that's why ECOWAS has very strong support from Africa, from European Union. European Union, notice that when they have conflicts in West Africa, they don't mobilize forces for it. They don't ask United Nations to come in or Security Council or they go back to West Africa and say, send intervention force. So we are dealing with our problems in our region, and we are doing it very, very effectively.
Just over a week after the military coup in Guinea, which overthrew President Alpha Conde, life is gradually returning to normal. Now let's go to the capital, Conakry, to meet traders of the city's Kaloum market and see how economic activities are resuming there.
Conakry Kaloum market is one of the markets that supply the population of the capital with all kinds of food products. The market had closed its doors to customers for 2 days because of the coup. During the period of closure, traders, most of whom are women, saw some of the fruit and vegetables rot. This caused food prices to rise after the market opened.
With the military in power, nobody knows when things can get out of hand. Just seeing a soldier with a gun in or around the market scares us. Often we are forced to go home sooner than we expected, and this affects our business.
For the moment, we can say that we are reassured because after Sunday's coup d'etat, Colonel Mohammadi Doumbouya had invited all citizens to resume activities on Monday. We came and sold some items, but the worry is that the price of foodstuff is rising and this does not help the people. Today, imported rice that was sold at 250,000 Guinean francs is now sold at 320,000. The current authorities must act to bring down the price of food.
Out of fear and caution, many customers had to wait for 2 days before going back to the capital's market to buy food.
The uncertain atmosphere in the city of Conakry is already scary, and staying late at the market is even more frightening. We are afraid because a military man is always a military man. He has no friends. For the moment, everything is fine here. We hope that the price of the products will go down a bit to satisfy our customers.
In most of the markets in Conakry, customers and vendors are still discussing the political crisis that is currently shaking the country. Wholesale and retail market holders praise the junta for preventing the looting of their shops during and after the coup. This has brought hope and confidence back to the Guinean people, who expect a lot from the ruling junta. Désiré Canon, CGTN, Conakry, Guinea.
South Africa's lockdown regulations have been further relaxed as the country sees a decline in its third wave of COVID-19 cases. In a televised national address on Sunday evening, President Cyril Ramaphosa announced that a sustained decline in infections has been witnessed over the last 2 weeks. CGTN's Ulisa Njamila has more.
South Africa has now moved down to level 2 of the lockdown. That's the second lowest of a 5-tier system. The eased restrictions offer a lifeline to businesses. It's also making it easier to register voters ahead of local government elections in November. Under this level, most activities are allowed under strict rules.
The hours of curfew will now start at 11 p.m. and end at 4 a.m. There is still a need for curfew. It also means that non-essential establishments like restaurants, bars, and fitness centers will need to close by 10 p.m. This is to allow their employees and patrons to travel home before the start of the curfew. It also means that all gatherings will now be limited to a maximum of 250 people indoors. And this has been raised from the 50 people indoors, and it will now mean that outdoors it will be limited to 500 people from the 100 that we had.
The sale of alcohol from retail outlets for off-site consumption will be permitted between 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. from Monday to Friday. Alcohol sales for on-site consumption will also be allowed as per license conditions up to 10 p.m. In a bid to encourage vaccination, the president also announced that his government will soon be providing further information on an approach to vaccine passports. The passports will likely be used as evidence of vaccination for various purposes and events. The president urged South Africans to vaccinate against COVID-19.
The day will soon come when we can gather again without restrictions. The day will soon come when we can fill our stadiums and music venues and travel more freely around without the fear of becoming ill or losing our loved ones. How soon that day arrives depends on one thing: how many of us get vaccinated and how quickly we get vaccinated.
Ramaphosa says the government has secured enough doses of COVID-19 jabs and that the supply of vaccines is no longer a constraint. South Africa ultimately wants to vaccinate at least 70% of the population, or 39 million people. This is to ensure that there's herd immunity against the coronavirus. The current restrictions will be reviewed in 2 weeks' time, depending on the state of the pandemic. Udisan Jambala for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
The Democratic People's Republic of Korea has test-fired what it calls a new type of long-range cruise missile. The state news agency KCNA says the launches over the weekend were successful, with senior officials observing the event. The report says the new weapon holds strategic significance, giving the country another effective means of deterrence against hostile forces. The launches come just days after a military parade in Pyongyang to mark the country's 73rd founding anniversary. The U.S. military says the tests pose threats to the country's neighbors and beyond. Jack Barton reports.
Normally we get information on these types of launches either from the U.S. officials or from the South Korean government, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This time the first we're hearing about it is from DPRK Central News Agency. What they're saying is there were multiple tests of these long-range cruise missiles over the weekend. They flew for a total of 7,580 seconds. My maths might be wrong, but I think that's a little short of an hour and a half. With a total range of 1,500 kilometers. And while they were heading towards their targets, which according to the Central News Agency, they hit accurately, they were flying ovals, figure of eights, patterns to prove that they were true cruise missiles and that they could deviate from their course while heading to their target, which of course makes them much harder to intercept, but it also means they can fly very low to the ground, going below hill peaks, making them very hard to detect as well. Nonetheless, South Korean media here calling it a low-level provocation so far because they don't contravene UN security sanctions targeting the DPRK. Unlike ballistic missiles, which utilize a rocket engine, these are low-flying missiles, as I just described, which use a jet engine. So the UN doesn't ban these, or the testing or the use of these missiles by the DPRK. However, this is the first time they're flying long-range missiles that can carry a bigger payload. Perhaps it won't be worrying Washington too much, but the fact that these missiles can easily reach Japan or South Korea and could potentially carry miniaturized nuclear warheads, something that Pyongyang has stated it is seeking to do, will definitely be ringing alarm bells here.
Iran will allow the United Nations nuclear watchdog to service cameras at its nuclear sites. Constructive talks were held on Sunday between the International Atomic Energy Agency and the head of Iran's nuclear program. Tehran restricted access early this year to the recording equipment which the UN installed to monitor the country's atomic activities. UN officials say they are ready to assist in negotiations to restore the 2015 nuclear deal after talks stalled. The FBI has released a newly declassified document related to its investigation of the September 11th attacks. It's the first document to be released after an executive order by President Joe Biden. It includes details of contacts between the hijackers and several Saudi officials. Toby Muse reports.
This weekend, the FBI released a heavily redacted 16-page, formally classified document related to the 9/11 attacks. The report from 2016 shows alleged contacts between a man US authorities suspect of being a Saudi intelligence agent and at least 2 of the 9/11 hijackers when they first arrived in the US. The support from the agent was alleged to have been travel, lodging and financing to help the hijackers. It also provided details about the FBI's investigation into whether a Saudi consular officer in Los Angeles had given logistical support to these hijackers. However, the document does not provide proof of any support in the 9/11 attacks themselves. Some of the families of those who died in the attacks say the contacts show there is more to investigate. Even with the unfortunate number of redactions, the report contains a host of bombshell new revelations, said the 9/11 Families United in a statement. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has consistently denied any government role in the attacks. This past week, the Saudi embassy in Washington issued a statement saying that any allegation that Saudi Arabia is complicit in the September 11 attacks is categorically false. Biden has faced repeated calls by families of those who lost their loved ones in the 9/11 attacks to release more documents related into the 9/11 investigation. Many had said that they did not want the president to attend the 20th anniversary ceremonies marking the attacks unless more information was forthcoming. The report was released just hours after President Biden arrived to the site of the World Trade Center Memorial on Saturday. Toby Muse reporting for CGTN, Washington.
Let's now catch up with the day's business news. We get the latest from Uche.
Thanks, Peninah. And coming up on Africa Live Biz. Tanzania ratifies the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. And Egypt resumes the sale of stakes in its state-owned enterprises as economic conditions improve.
The East China Sea, home of dream seekers, where China's hub for reform and opening up connects with the maritime Silk Road. Whether it's exploring the busiest seaport and trade zone, or witnessing how locals strive for a better life. Join CGTN's adventure, Tides of Change Part 2. A journey enchanted by a dynamic ocean and beyond.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Well, let's start off in Tanzania. The country has ratified the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. Now, the move is seen as a boost for investment in the country, as it will also grant access to a bigger market for sales of its produce. The agreement has been formalized by Parliament 3 years after first being established. Here's CGTN's Isaac Lucando with more.
These sacks of Tanzanian cashew nuts could soon end up in African countries that sit within the African Continental Free Trade Area. Tanzania has become the 39th out of 55 African countries to officially join, opening up new markets for its products and services. Economists say the country's investment in manufacturing and food processing over the last 5 years could pay off.
A lot of potential now to our private sector in Tanzania to explore these new markets in southern, eastern, and even northern and western Africa, because we already have these industries ready and we're still pushing more industries to be developed.
The United Nations estimates that the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement will boost trade between countries by 52% by 2022, providing a much-needed boost to nations that have been hit hard by the COVID-19 pandemic.
We depend a lot of importation, but if we had a tendency of trading amongst ourselves and developing our industries within Africa, then probably the inter-Africa trade would have been above 40-50%, less of the effect of the COVID would have been felt in our economies.
The World Bank estimates that around 1.3 billion people live within the African Continental Free Trade Area, which has a combined gross domestic product of $3.4 trillion. 30 million Africans are expected to be lifted out of extreme poverty as a result of the agreement, with Tanzania's government hoping its own citizens will be some of those who benefit. Tanzania mainly exports to Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. By turning its attention to markets on the African continent, the country hopes to grow its economy with profits from places much closer to home. Implementing the agreement won't be easy. Apart from poor connectivity in terms of roads and railways, most countries fear becoming a dumping ground for other countries' goods. To fully benefit from the agreement, economists are calling on the Tanzanian government to have a clear export strategy.
Just a matter of having speciality in terms of its export. What do we really want to export into these countries? And really put a lot of emphasis and a lot of special arrangements to boost these industries, these sectors in manufacturing, in food processing, in agriculture. Those will be able to really be competitive.
Tanzania's economy has averaged 7% growth over the last decade. The government hopes that the agreement will be the vehicle that lifts it even further. Isaac Lukando, CGTN, Dar es Salaam.
And heading to Egypt now, terror attacks have severely affected the country's tourism industry. The Egyptian government says it will invest more than $540 million in the sector, a sign that tourism could be on the path to recovery. Here's Adel El Maroui with the details.
Tourism in Egypt has been recovering slowly in the second half of 2021. In September, the nation's Tourism and Antiquities Ministry said hotel occupancy rates reached 70% in Red Sea resort cities, up from 43% in June. That follows the lifting of travel restrictions by some European countries and after Russia ended a 6-year-long ban on flights to Egypt.
As a tour guide who speaks Russian, we have been greatly affected since the 2015 Russian plane crash. It is by far the worst incident that happened which concerned Egypt. COVID-19 was global. It made the situation worse. We had no work at all. We looked for alternatives and we have managed to expand the Ukrainian market and other Eastern European countries, which made up for part of the drop in tourism revenues.
In recent months, the Egyptian government has been promoting the country as a tourist destination. It has introduced electronic visas for the first time. Almost all fees for flight services at Egyptian airports have been reduced or waived. Moreover, all workers in the tourism sector have been vaccinated and health preventive measures have been imposed.
There are a lot of measures in place. As you can see, we're all wearing masks. I've been vaccinated, as have many Egyptians have had the vaccine as well. And our travel was conducted with international PCR tests as well. So I feel very safe traveling to Egypt.
There was a 92% drop in tourism revenues after the COVID-19 pandemic hit Egypt. This year, the country is expecting to rake in up to $7 billion in tourism revenues as the sector recovers. That's about 54% of 2019's $13 billion revenue. Tour operators, though, are still worried as their debts have piled. Unless the sector fully recovers, they say they could face a financial crisis.
We paid monthly salaries of about $64,000 every month. Later it went down to half this amount. We took loans from the state to pay the salaries, and until now we haven't begun paying our debts. Tourism must return to normal rates for at least 3 years to cover these debts. The sector is starting to recover. It won't be back to normal until we learn how to coexist with the pandemic.
From the 2011 uprising, terrorist attacks that followed it, the 2015 Russian plane crash, and finally the global pandemic, Egypt's tourism industry has been getting one hard blow after the other for the past 10 years. As tourists' numbers picks up, Egypt is expanding its investments in this industry to maximize revenues in the coming years. Adel Mahroui, CGTN, Cairo.
And still in Egypt, the country is planning to restart a stalled program to list or sell additional stakes in its state-run companies by the end of this year. The move to restart the state-backed public offer program appears to signal that the government is now confident about market conditions that had soared over the past couple of years. CGTN's Yasser came with more.
The move by the government to push through the initial public offers of its state-owned companies has been postponed a few times since 2018. First, because of the financial challenges facing emerging markets in 2019, followed by the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic last year, which has caused a slowdown in global stock markets. But Egypt's decision to float state assets shares end of this year is a sign of a possible recovery from the fallout caused by the coronavirus pandemic.
It was expected that this year would still be a tough year as the pandemic continues to ravage economies. But what is happening is the opposite because of the huge emergency funds released by most governments worldwide, including in Egypt. This has helped to pump liquidity into stock markets, while the rollout of vaccines has restored the appetite of investors to be more economically active. That's why the government here forecasts the end of this year as the ideal time to launch the stalled IPO program in the Egyptian stock market.
Initially, the government had targeted a bank, a bottled water company, and a real estate group amongst 20 state-run companies to be floated in the market. But recently, Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi announced that the government will add multi-billion-dollar mega projects like the new administrative capital and the new Alamein city to the IPO list.
This step is considered the gateway for revitalizing the Egyptian stock market as a positive component in the economy. The role of the EGX is to help finance the economy, attract investments for individuals and companies. For years, the stock market has been stagnant and ineffective. The new IPOs will raise the market value of the Egyptian stock exchange and will make it more attractive to foreign investments and stimulate the market after a long slowdown.
Experts believe the state-backed IPOs slated for the end of 2021 will be a big success and will bring much-needed investments for the government to finance its new developmental projects. Yas Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
And in Uganda, a group of tailors has found a way to alter their business model to minimize the effects of COVID-19. And they say the secret is in the material they're using. CGTN's Hilary Ayesiga has their story from Kampala.
Willie Mwangi is designing craft shoes made from leather. It's a new material for Mwangi and a new product with promising returns.
Why I prefer these craft shoes, we can sell to the communities. And apart from this community, we were going around. We had some other boys who did not have work, some youth who did not have work at that lockdown. We were giving them the shoes. They were going around and selling them.
Mwangi used to design clothing made from fabric, but in April last year, he had to close down his business.
I was also affected by a pandemic because there was lockdown. There we saw at Chikowo. There was a lockdown, the shops were closed, and we were not traveling anywhere.
The COVID-19 lockdown also affected textile shipments into Uganda. So when he was able to reopen his shop, he started working with leather, which is readily available to make a number of finished products. Mwangi says he makes about 100 pairs of craft shoes per day, but it's still not enough to meet the growing demand of leather products on the market. Uganda has historically exported 90% of its leather. The Ugandan Tailors Association sees crafting the raw material into finished products as a great opportunity.
We are looking to see that we encourage our tailors to go into leather products because it's a wider business. And it has the wider market within the country and outside Uganda.
The association is also targeting the country's developing automotive industry.
When the pandemic came in, also, the innovations come in, because our automotive mobile buses from Chira, it's now in place. So we are also looking to see that we design the bus seats. So this also will drive us into a business, a bigger business.
But for Willie Mwangi and other independent tailors, the decision to venture into leather products is gradually helping their businesses to recover from the effects of the pandemic. He says he now receives regular orders from neighboring countries such as South Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Hilary Isga, CGTN, Kampala, Uganda.
And that's all for now on Africa Live Biz. But coming up later on Global Business Africa, South Africa to introduce a vaccine passport to be used for various purposes and events going forward. All that coming up top of the hour. For now, we're heading into a short break, but do stay with us. My colleague Peninah is back with more after this.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Welcome back to Africa Live. An Egyptian craftsman living in Algeria is hoping to leave behind a legacy of making furniture using palm branches. This he hopes to achieve by training young people, as CGTN's Beryl Oro reports.
Surrounded by palm branches, Egyptian craftsman Abu Nasser uses his hands and feet to craft bespoke furniture in his workshop in the small town east of Algiers.
I inherited this craft from our ancestors. I've been doing this job for more than 40 years. I don't earn a lot, but even if I had, I couldn't dream of leaving this job. It runs in my blood. I have been doing it for 40 years and I know all the tiny details about it. I don't believe that anyone can leave a job they have been doing for 40 years and forget about it easily.
Survival and decades-long legacy to uphold led Nasser to move from Egypt to Algeria.
I came here to work because I couldn't feed my children and had to immigrate to be able to live. After all, I am in an Arab country. It isn't real immigration and I could go back to my country at any time.
The decision to move paid off. Business is good for the Abu Nasser family, who have received increased orders for furniture since relocating.
God doesn't leave any of his servants. Our furniture is like a dessert. Only those who can afford it buy it. God helps us and we are working and earning money.
From handcrafted tables and chairs to wind chimes, the craft was passed down to Abu Nasser through generations of his family, and he is determined to keep it alive and train others in the work before moving back to Egypt.
I would like to teach it to Algerian youth because sooner or later I will go back to my country, and if I go tomorrow, this work will disappear after 14 years of working here in Algeria. But if a young man or 2, 10 or 20 learnt this craft, it will become an Algerian craft and they will spread it in the country and it will be a country craft.
His apprentice hopes to continue his legacy of crafting furniture after Abu Nasser leaves.
I chose this job and later hope to teach it and spread it in all the Algerian cities so it doesn't disappear, to pass it down to our children in the future as Uncle Nasser has done.
A change in location forged Nasser's calling. He can only hope that the age-old skills he has shared will be enough to carry his legacy forward to the generations to come. Beryl Oro, CGTN.
Well, coming up in sports news, Arsene Wenger's proposal of having a World Cup every 2 years is gathering steam.